about the rate change, loss ratio, and mega loss indices. First of all, please make a screenshot of these abbreviations. You will need them. So 1, 2, 3, click, and then we move, as Stefan did, to the first important page where we have to clearly state that whatever we present here is in full accordance with the IMIA antitrust statement, and we got this also confirmed from an external legal opinion. Important, especially that we take care about the way we present here rates and claims. So let's warm up and set the scene. As you can see down here, this is a screenshot from Swiss Re Sigma 2018 publication about the construction market. We can see here that in the period between 2002 and 2018, the engineering premium roughly tripled. In the same period, since 2002, the rates actually reduced by 50%. So this already means that we have more exposure in general in our portfolios because premium went up in total, but per dollar exposure, we get less premium. This is addressed by the IMIA rate change index. So we also wanted to understand what does it do on the aggregated large losses per underwriting year, and as well, by the way, I will mention in a minute, by occurrence year. So in the same period since 2002 to 2018, all here is in underwriting year, we have a massive increase in frequency and severity of mega large losses. For us, mega large losses, we define the threshold, whatever is above 50 million large loss from ground up per individual loss, and we simply were summing them up per underwriting year. So we see a clear increase in frequency and severity, and in the aggregate, we see that they were more than 4 times bigger than in the beginning, in the early 2000s and late 90s. All in all, and this will be tackled by the IMIA loss ratio index, we see an increase due to all these facts I try to summarize here on loss ratios. As an association, obviously, we are not allowed to talk about ultimate loss ratios per underwriting year. This is your task, together with your actuaries, to assess this and to benchmark yourself against the figures you see here. But we can already see that younger underwriting years, not yet that much developed, are normally in the same point of time showing higher incurred loss ratios. The jumps here are due to mega losses. We have several jumps, also later more about it. In general, we can say the premium increase shown here could not offset the rate decrease and the large loss increase. This is also the reason why, in general, the global market loss ratios seem to increase. As Dieter already pointed out, we could not see these trends too clearly. When you dig a little bit more into detail, you might see indications in the country stats, in the traditional IMIA premiums and loss statistics, but we felt at IMIA that it's important that we dig more into detail and that we assess the situation by far more, I would say, statistically and from an actuarial perspective. And we formulated a vision that we would like to make the complex engineering insurance market tangible for all of us. And we were looking for a partner who is experienced in this, and we found it with Perils. It's a company based in Zurich, and they're owned by the insurance and reinsurance industry. So this was an initiative more than 10 years ago. Several of our companies were founding members of this company. In the meantime, obviously, fully independent, and they have a lot of expertise in benchmarking, in producing indices, in statistics, and they provided their services for this task here. And together we were stating the mission that we produce together reference points which help us as a engineering insurance market to benchmark our activities. Actually, the way this works and how the process is defined and the method was designed is relatively simple. Perils operates like an independent third party, and whatever data we need to produce the IMIA rate change index, the loss ratio index, or the mega loss index goes through Perils. They collect the data, they validate the data, they anonymize them, they aggregate them, and only then, and this is compliant with antitrust and data protection regulation, only then the data are handed over to IMIA. So IMIA has absolutely no access to raw data. So as Stefan already introduced, in order to understand the indices which we are producing here, we have first to have a clear picture about the market. Here again, we have our own statistics. We know that roughly 30% of the market is represented in our country stats. We know that, for example, China is not reporting, big part of Americas is not reporting. We have seen in Stefan's stats, important players, for example, out of Germany or the London market are not reporting to this. Also, Middle East and Africa are underrepresented in our organization. So roughly 30% is represented by our stats. So multiply 7 to 9 million times 3, 24 billion. This is very much in line with the Sigma 2018 assessment. They also see the market on this level, half project, half annual business, and IDI is the part up here. We asked during the loss ratio index survey how our contributors see the market. As this was a pilot study, we had not yet that much feedback, but I think for a pilot study, very pleased about roughly 10 feedbacks. We could use 6 of them, and they also see the majority sees the market on this level. And so we would assume that the global gross written premium per underwriting year is on a level of 20 to 30 billion dollars, half of it project, half of it annual premium. For the loss ratio index I already mentioned, we had roughly 1 billion premium feedback from 6 markets. This represents roughly 5% of the market. For the rate change index, we had 14 markets contributing, 7 out of the global segment and 7 out of the regional segment. For the rate change index, we think we have about 10% of the market represented in our stats. As our market, the engineering market, is predominantly a proportional market, and direct FAC and co-insurance, we believe these figures are sufficiently representative for the situation in the market, what we produce here. Last word on the mega loss index before we start with the results. We could identify since the early 90s, 90 project losses. We focused for the time being on project losses, excess of 50 million from ground up. In total, we could identify an aggregate of more than 10 billion mega losses in this round about 30 years. So the first results. Keep in mind, and this is also the reason why we as an association can assess the rate change index and publish it, because we do it on a qualitative basis. What do I mean with qualitative basis? We do not ask you what are the rates you are seeing. We ask you how do you see the market compared to past years and compared to our anchor point, which was randomly chosen in 2010, which we defined as 100%. So you see the qualitative feedback is then obviously translated into a quantitative figure so that we can work with this. But nevertheless, important for you guys to understand that the basis of it is a qualitative assessment. I will not go too much into the details of these different occupancies or type of risks. You can read later on. I will continue with the average of these feedbacks. But what is important for me, that we in the meantime could really trigger this rate change discussion in the market. We have several publications. Stefan was also mentioning it. We had a recent one which was published. So the discussion about rate changes is ongoing in our market, important for all of us to understand and interpret how were they produced. So in our case, we know exactly the method. The method is public, and all of you receive the survey, and you know how this rate change index is built. When you read such figures, we do not clearly know how they produce them. What is their anchor point? What is their baseline? Do they report pure or risk-adjusted rate changes? This is just to highlight that it's very important that we compare apples with apples and peers with peers. But the positive aspect is here that the market starts really to discuss these very important rate change indicators. As I said, I will continue with the average. And the average is also important to mention, is half from global players, half from the local market. After 2018, we all remember calendar year 2018 was a year where we have seen a lot of mega large losses in our market. And as a consequence, many players, more than 25 players, reassessed their risk appetite and capacity. Some of them withdraw from the market. So after 2018, we have seen a clear change in the market. And this is also the explanation why we see a turning point in the rate change index. We have an increase in the rate change index from 18 to 19 of roughly 14%, and from 19 to mid-2020, 10%. Important to mention here that this plus 24% is below the level of capacity which disappeared in our market. It's also important for all of us to be aware of the current rating level, which is more or less on a level we have seen in 2012, 13, 14. If you consider this profitable or technical rate, we are not allowed to comment on this as an association. Each of you has to assess if they believe that this level is a sustainable rating level. Also a very nice finding, I will mention it later on again, we could show a correlation with loss ratio increase in the country stats, in the IMIA stats, which are assessed through the country associations, although there is a lot of, I would say, criticism towards the way we are producing these stats, but still, on a long run, if you take a time slot which is big enough, we are analyzed 12 years, you can see, as Peter already showed, a clear trend in loss ratio increase, and in the same period from 2005 to 2017, we had a reduction in rate which is correlating to the increase in loss ratio on financial year basis. And the same we would obviously also like to see in the IMIA loss ratio index. I will show you this in a minute. So this is the IMIA rate change index correlating with the loss ratio increase of financial year country stats. The global market showed by far a harsher or stronger reaction after underwriting year 2018, influenced by occurrence year 2018, most likely because there we had a lot of losses, you will see later on. And on the global level, we had an important increase of rates, but still keep in mind we are on a level of 2012. Again, if this is a sustainable level, is not our right to judge on it. It's your task to benchmark this against the figures. The local market showed by far less rebound effect, and this is somehow surprising. I mean, first of all, we could say only 7 contributors So if this is really representative on the global segment, I would say 7 players, this is representative. On the local players, as we know, we have many countries being member of IMIA 7 is maybe not that representative, but nevertheless, between the global and the local market, there is a connection via facilities, MGAs, binders, treaties, FAC-out agreements, etc. So actually, we would have expected here also kind of a rebound effect. So far, we could not see it from the 7 respondents we had. What is also giving me some confidence and some hope that in general we are more conservative with our prognosis than what finally happens and finally can be observed. So we are, as every year, we asked you also last year for the prognosis for 2020. So we asked in 19, how do you see 2020? And as you can see, the green bar, which is the actually observed rate level, was always above. There is one exception. I come to it in a second. But in general, the green bar, the actual observed, was always higher or better than the prognosis from last year. And this is not the first year we see this. Also, the last 2 years we had the same effect. So there is some hope that we are conservative and the market reacts stronger. Also, in the oil and gas sector, we had an increase in rate, but people expected more. So we can say we had growth on rate level, but less than expected. This is the one exception, but the pattern is clear. In general, our prognosis is more conservative than what we observed. Now we're coming to the loss ratio index, and Dieter, Mike, and Stefan already mentioned why we are doing this. We were not really happy with the financial year way the country stats are reported. And when you go to the working group paper 73, which was chaired by Jörg Buff and Partnerie and sponsored by Oscar a few years ago, you will understand they go really into detail and explain why for long-term business like project business, financial year basis is not an accurate way of showing the results, mainly because the premium and the losses are not linked. The losses stem from other underwriting years than the premium, and this introduces volatility. In addition, when we have reporting of written premium, you bring down the loss ratio. This is also something we would not like to see because this makes it more difficult and shows a better loss ratio than the loss ratio would actually be on earned or booked figures. So please, if you want to have more details, here is the link. Go on the paper from Jörg Buff and his colleagues. So again, back to Dieter's stats, country stats. As I said, we have a lot of volatility in the country stats. This is due to the financial year basis, but when you take a period which is big enough, you see a clear trend. You see a clear trend in loss ratio increase, and this is correlating to the rate decrease we could assess by the IMIA rate change index. And this is a very important finding. It's kind of validating that the rate change index shows us something meaningful and is also giving some blessing to the very much criticized country stats. Still, and Dieter also pointed out, we have to know how we read them. First of all, they are financial year basis. They have rather written instead of earned premium basis. Country stats are mainly representing the local market and not the global market. And you will see trends only if you take a period which is big enough. So again, the details and the theory why we should focus on underwriting year is given by working group paper 73. It also explains why we should focus on earned, and booked premium is the closest proxy to earned premium, and by the way, standardized. So we have there standardized booking rules. So the earned or booked premium is the way premium should be reported on an underwriting year basis and compared with the incurred losses in the same underwriting year. Again, as an association, we are not allowed to assess IBNRs. And this is now the first IMIA loss ratio index result. At the same point in time, are the development years. Young underwriting years in general show higher loss ratio in the same point in time than old underwriting years. And this is already a strong indication that we have a correlation between IMIA loss ratio index and IMIA rate change index, a negative correlation. Rates down, loss ratios up. We have two underwriting years in our loss ratio index which did not show important large loss activity. So the development of these years are mainly driven by attritional losses, and attritional losses are driven by rates. And we see here again, in the absence of large losses, the lower the rate in the same point in time, the higher the loss ratio. This is not a proof of our concept, but is a strong evidence or a strong indicator that we are heading into the right direction. Luckily, we have even more indicators or evidences. For example, we have important loss ratio jumps, and we could link them clearly to large losses, which we will show later on in the IMIA mega loss index. There are a few more, but these are the most important jumps in the loss ratio. Maturity for these kind of books are not achieved before 8 years, so ultimate loss ratios will only be accessible after 8 years onwards. So all these years here are still under development. For regional and local books, this is obviously shorter because normally the risks in regional and local portfolios are less complex. As I already mentioned, in general, younger underwriting years show higher loss ratios in the incurred loss ratios in the same point in time. And as an additional indication or strong evidence, the last diagonal, which is driven by rate and by large losses, is in general above the average of the same point in time. This is an additional evidence that IMIA loss ratio index and IMIA rate change index are negatively correlated. If we could assess from an actuarial standpoint the ultimate loss ratios, as I said, this is not allowed, we could give more accurate statements, but this as an association is not allowed. This is the same, these are the same results just on a graph. And as you can see, regular years like this is underwriting year 2009, in the absence of large losses, no big jumps, and 2010 here, 2010 in the same point in time, higher than 9. This is an indication that it's correlated to the rate change index. Jumps are explained by large losses. I will explain you in a minute. We all know that underwriting year 11 and underwriting year 12 or 14 were very much, hold on, this is not 14, this is 8. 14 is somewhere here, had important jumps. Here you would see it better, had important jumps by identifiable large loss incidents. We can also show here that only after development of bigger than 8 years, we will obtain a certain maturity, and the underwriting year will show or will slightly approach to its ultimate loss ratio. It's also important that at the same point in time, after 2 years, after 3 years, after 4 years, the young underwriting years, 18 here, underwriting year 17 here, 16 here, 15 here, 14 here, the young underwriting years at the same point in time are in general at the highest level, and at another indicator that we have a negative correlation with the rate change index. And the last diagonal is always the last point, and this is driven by rates, as we have seen, as well as by large loss jumps like here or here. Now, the IMIA Mega Loss Index is explaining the jumps and also assessing the frequency and severity growth of large losses in the last 30 years. First of all, we focused on losses in excess of 50 million since the 90s. We focused for the time being on project losses. We identified around about 90 losses which were above the threshold we defined. And we assessed frequency, severity, and its aggregate per underwriting year and per occurrence year, but always the same losses, but showing in a different way. The figures you will see here are best estimate figures from ground up, and obviously the challenges, Dieter was already mentioning it, are exchange rates and indexations as we are looking at losses of 30 years. A few examples what IMIA Mega Loss Index could also provide. You will find this in the newsletter sent out in April, newsletter 44. I will not go too much into detail, but we have several ways how we could assess the large losses, geographic origin or type of risk affected or cause of loss. But for us, by far more important is that we focus on the frequency and on the average severity by large loss. And there we see a clear trend. Before 2007, so from the 90s to 2007, we had roughly a frequency of below 2 mega large losses per year, while after 2007, we had by far more than frequency 5 mega large losses per year, and these years are still under development. And here you also see since 2007, each and every underwriting year was affected by mega large losses, while in the 90s and early 2000s, there are several underwriting years we could not find any large losses above our threshold. The average severity also increased by roughly 30% after 2007. And here again, we are still on the development for the young years, but we see first of all the same message like for the frequency. Each and every underwriting year shows these losses, obviously, and they are higher than before 2007. So average severity below 100 million per individual loss. After 2007, the average loss above 100 million, the delta is roughly 30%. So you might say, yeah, this is driven by net cat, but we could only link 20% of the mega large losses to net cat, and 80% are linked to man-made causes of loss and terms and conditions, policy terms and conditions. So the biggest part of these losses, of these 90 losses, of this 10 billion aggregated loss amount, more than 10 billion, are induced by man-made causes, respectively terms and conditions. Now, per underwriting year, you remember the jumps which we showed in the IMIA loss ratio index, and these are the underwriting years we show here. Underwriting year 2011, by far the biggest, but also 14, an important one. Actually, since 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, each of these underwriting years produced jumps in the IMIA loss ratio index, and this is due to these large losses, to these mega losses. And what we show here is the aggregate in the case of a relatively young underwriting year, aggregate of 2 losses, while in 2015 we have 8 losses which are aggregating, etc., etc. So important that these underwriting years produced the large losses from these underwriting years produce the jumps in the IMIA loss ratio index. For your information, the blue bar are the physical damages, while the orange part of the bar are the DSU fraction of these losses aggregated, at least the DSUs we could identify. As we also said, these mega losses stemming from older underwriting years, normally they materialize 4 to 8 years after inception. This is also the reason why we need roughly 8 years until we can say an underwriting year is mature and until we can assess the ultimate loss ratio per underwriting year. As we also see in the aggregate, we are now more on a level of 500 million to a billion per underwriting year, while before 2007, we are far below this 500 million to a billion in the aggregate per underwriting year. Majorly impact could be observed obviously on the global market, to a lower extent on the local market. And as I already mentioned, these more than 10 billions are not very well distributed. Most of the losses stem from underwriting years 2007 onwards. Only 2 billion could be allocated to the 20 years prior to this. So from early 90s to 2006, 16 years. When we take the same losses and we show them per occurrence year, so in the calendar year when they happened, it becomes obvious why most likely after 2018 we saw a clear reaction from the market. As I told you, many markets reassessed their risk appetite, their capacity, many withdraw from the market. Interestingly, the drop in capacity is higher than the increase in rate changes so far. This is also an interesting finding, I would say. But important is that, as we already said, since calendar year 2007 onwards, we see a clear increase of frequency and severity, as we already explained. We see important drop of capacity and increase in rates after 2018. And as I already mentioned, various markets reassessed their position. This has a direct impact, obviously, on the global market, but via facilities, binders, MGAs, and treaties, of course, also on the local market, because the global market serves part of the capacity to the local market. Now, how do these three indices play together? The rate change index, the mega loss index, and the loss ratio index. We already explained occurrence year, calendar year 2018 had a clear impact on the rates. We can call this a turning point. We had a rebound on the rates until mid-2020 to a rating level of roughly 2012, 13, 14. The underwriting year 2012-13 show incurred loss ratios so far, and you find this here, between 62 and 68%. Obviously, this has to be developed to ultimate, and if this is on a profitable level, here again, an association is not allowed to assess this, but you could do this together with your actuaries. You have an assessment of the ultimate loss ratios, which sits somewhere here. You add internal and external expenses, and you calculate a combined ratio, and this will give you the answer on these questions. As I said, this is the rating level we are currently in, which is in line with the more or less underwriting year 12-13. We had the jumps in loss ratio driven by occurrences or large losses in 2018, calendar year 2018, and this was responsible for this turning point. This is our interpretation from the data we have from the market. Coming back to maturity and development, we all know that these young underwriting years are still under development. They are under development by rates. The rates are lower for these young underwriting years here, as we could show in the IMIA rate change index, but they have still potential, touch wood, hopefully not, but they have potential for large losses. As we know, the large losses take several years until they occur, mainly due to the reason that we're talking there about mega risks, which take some time until they are 100% built up. So potential for development due to rates and due to loss ratios, I would say, for underwriting years 2013 onwards. Here again, rates and large losses will be the factors which will drive the ultimate loss ratio development of these younger underwriting years. Coming back to the correlation, this at the end would validate mutually the rate change index and the loss ratio index. We could so far show the correlation between the country stats, incurred loss ratio on financial year basis. We know the disadvantages, but the very big finding, the negative correlation, this is a very important result. And we hope that we can also later on show this correlation between IMIA loss ratio index. I showed you already that we are very confident. We had very strong indicators and evidences that there is a correlation, but due to the fact that we are not allowed to assess the ultimate loss ratio, we obviously have volatility here. So as I already explained, strong evidences of negative correlation, but only provable with ultimate loss ratios. And as an association, this is not possible for us. Now, summary. The IMIA rate change index shows a rating environment roughly on a level of underwriting year 2012-13 in the average. We have growth since 2018 of roughly 24%. This growth is below the drop of capacity we could observe in the same period. The global market, the direct and fact market rate increases were in general higher than the local rate increases, while we have to say we had here only 7 contributors, so it could be that some local markets have higher rate increases, some lower, but with the data we have, we can say that the global market rebounded more than the local market. We, as already explained, could show the negative correlation between the country stats loss ratio and the IMIA rate change index, and we have strong evidences that this is also the case for IMIA loss ratio index, which would validate all these assessments mutually. The IMIA loss ratio index shows quicker incurred loss ratios for younger underwriting years. This is, as I said, an indication that rate change index is correlating with loss ratio index. The old years show jumps after more than 7 years. This is due to the mega large losses or the large loss activity in general. And we could show that on financial or calendar year 2018, the losses and incidents happening in this year led to a massive drop in global capacity. We could show with the IMIA mega loss index that frequency and severity massively increased, and this was not mainly due to net cat, but mainly driven by man-made, respectively, terms and conditions. And we could show how the rate change index and the loss ratio index and the mega loss index are linked, respectively, how they play together. And this was also already mentioned that the rates reacted massively after 2018. That's all from my side for now. It's important, as already mentioned by the previous speakers, that all of you contribute to these benchmarks. The more data we have, the better we can assess the market. As I said, compliance and data protection, antitrust compliance is guaranteed by the involvement of our partner Perils. And as some of the respondents had difficulties to work with the surveys we were sending out. We will do a training session. You get an invitation later on during this month, and we will instruct people how the data can be processed. So that's all from my side. I don't hear you, Mike.
Mike, you're muted. Okay, I think until Mike finds his voice back, just interrupt me then. Simon, Dieter, thanks a lot. That was marvelous work. I know it's been very elaborative and very much work for you to do all this. Also, thanks to Parallels for doing